So I'm so excited to be here today, everybody, to talk about career awards at the scientific interface and give you tips for writing a successful application. And before I dive fully into the CASI program, I also wanted to just tell you a little bit about Burroughs Wellcome Fund and sort of orient you to what it means to receive foundation funding itself. So the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, I don't know if you have ever heard of Burroughs Wellcome Pharma Company, but this was a company that was started way back in the 1800s, and it grew significantly in the 20th century. Many of you may be familiar with what is now known today as GlaxoSmithKline. So that's the origins of Burroughs Wellcome. Our two founders here, actually, an interesting tidbit, were the first to develop giving drugs in a tablet form and created what was called tabloids at that time. So in the 50s, this pharmaceutical company created a nonprofit arm, and they were very socially conscious and social minded. And then in the 90s, we split off to become completely independent because we received a $400 million gift from the Wellcome Trust. So we oftentimes get confused with Wellcome Trust versus Burroughs Wellcome. So this is just to kind of give you a sense. In some ways, we were sort of born out of a gift from the Wellcome Trust. Today, we have an endowment that typically hovers around 800 million, and we award between 35 to 40 million per year in grants to institutions, both in the United States and Canada. And this is something that I will also highlight later in terms of thinking about applying for awards here. It doesn't matter for the CASI award, for example, what personal nationality you are, as long as you are working either in the US or Canada, because that's who receives the funds. Our mission is to serve and strengthen society by nurturing a diverse group of leaders in the biomedical sciences. And we ultimately seek to improve human health, and we support a variety of initiatives, including science education, as well as research discoveries in some of the frontiers of greatest need. That's one of the hallmarks of foundation funding is we are here to fill in the gaps and support research that is important, but that may not be as easily or readily fundable from NIH or NSF or larger funding agencies. So we are here to support that research that still needs to be done and has the potential for broad impact, but is not being supported by NIH or other agencies. We are led by a board of directors, as well as our CEO here, Lou Muglia. And you may recognize some are actually from Duke, Bob Lefkowitz and Kaf Daraza. So if any of you are familiar with them, you can also connect with them to learn more about the Burroughs Wellcome Fund as well, in terms of connections to Duke. So in order to meet our mission, we have a variety of different program areas, and I wanted to highlight these beyond specifically the career awards at the scientific interface to sort of give you an idea of the types of things we fund and also let you know that we have other opportunities as well. So beyond the interfaces in science, I also oversee regulatory science. We support science education initiatives as well as diversity in science, infectious disease, climate change, career guidance for trainees, biomedical sciences, reproductive sciences, and more recently, we've actually built out a portfolio in science communication and also supporting science and the arts and science-art connection, where we're trying to reach the community about science through the arts. So with that introduction to Burroughs Wellcome, we can go ahead and get into talking about the CASI program in terms of what we're going to discuss today. It's going to be the broad who, what, when, where, why, and how of applying for a career award at the scientific interface. So we can start off with the question of why. So why apply for a grant in the first place? Obviously, people want to get money in order to do their research. But one thing I really wanted to point out is that whether or not you're successful in actually getting the grant, you also receive a lot of benefits from going through the process of applying for a grant in the first place. It's a time where you can really think about and generate new and creative ideas. And it's also a time where you can really lay out what your plans are for when you move into that faculty phase. And some of the research that has even been coming out that is looking at factors surrounding people moving into tenure track positions is showing that having a grant is not an absolute prerequisite for getting a tenure track position. So that's just something to keep in mind, the benefits that you'll receive, regardless of being successful in specifically getting the funding, although we know that is what everybody's ultimate goal will be as in terms of applying. For the CASI award itself, so this is a 5-year, $560,000 postdoc to faculty bridging award. So there are a lot of similarities to the K99R00. This actually predated that and started around the early 2000s. So we provide 1 to 2 years of mentor training in the postdoctoral phase, and we give you $100,000 per year during that. And we allow you to spend up to $80,000 for your stipend in the initial year and up to $85,000 in the second year. And then on top of that, one of the newer things that our board has approved is for up to $5,000 per year in order to be applied towards caregiving or childcare expenses. For the independent phase of the career, we provide up to 3 years of support at $120,000 per year. One thing I wanted to note about this is that these are all direct costs. As a foundation, and many foundations typically don't necessarily support indirect costs. So this is all the money that you're going to see directly to your lab. And if you compare that to the direct costs you actually receive from K99R00, it is a little bit on par with that. It's not too far off. Additionally, for eligibility, you can have no more than 5 years of postdoctoral experience at the time of your application. As I indicated before, international fellows are eligible. Really, the main thing is that you have to be working at an institution either in the United States or Canada, regardless of what your personal international status is. And basically, the hallmark of the CASI program is that it is specific to researchers who are bringing skills from chemistry, physics, computational sciences, mathematical sciences, and engineering to focus on answering biological questions at this scientific interface at the interdisciplinary fields. So the next question we'll move over to is when, in terms of when to apply. So for the CASI award, we only have one cycle per year, but it is broken up into a number of different phases. So for phase 1, this is our letter of intent phase. So it's limited in terms of what you have to prepare for the letter of intent phase, and that is what we are currently in now. You have to provide a 4,000 character essay, as well as your mentor provides a reference letter. A subset of those who submit a letter of intent will then be invited to submit a full application. And then out of those who submit a full application, a subset will be invited to interview. And you can sign up for alerts at this website, to get notifications about our cycle. So currently, I mentioned we're in the phase where the letters of intent are open. So those are due on September the 4th. And then we will send those to our review committee, and in mid-November or towards the end of November, you'll find out if you are invited to submit a full application. And if you are, those will be due on January 10th of this year. And then those get reviewed by the review committee, and we then invite a subset to interview. And I think you typically find out about that in March. And you will interview April 22nd through 23rd. And then you find out your notice of award in June of next year if you receive the CASI award. So in terms of thinking about when to apply, remembering that you've got this 5-year window, if you consider what might be too early, you won't have as much time to have built a publication record, but there will be plenty of time to prepare the grant. And one thing to note about the CASI award is that we do allow unlimited resubmissions. If you apply what might be considered too late, you won't have as much time to prepare the grant, And some of the comments I've seen is that the review committee might express concerns about the length of time in a postdoc. So what might be considered just right is where you've had enough time to clearly formulate your ideas, you've built a record of achievement, and can resubmit if needed. One thing to note, we do require a first author publication, but it doesn't have to specifically be in the postdoc phase. Your first author publication from graduate work can also count. I also did an analysis looking at the average number of time people spent in a postdoc in terms of looking at whether they were successful in getting this grant. And the average was somewhere between 20 to 30 months. That being said, we still have a wide range. Some people getting it later in their postdoc and some people getting it earlier. One of the main things is that it is about the science, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's just something to keep in mind because we have gotten questions about when do people typically tend to apply. We do have some exceptions to that 5-year rule, one of which we pointed out more recently. Or indicated this in the RFP, that parental or other well-justified family, medical, or military leave does not count against that 60-month clock. And we also grant an automatic 1-year extension for the birth or adoption of a child, and that would be per child. And we've also added a place on the LOI itself where you can indicate the explanation for why you're requesting this extension to the 5 years, but you must have received approval from myself and indicate this in the LOI. And this is something that the review committee will also see as well. So we tried to streamline this for anyone that has some of these exceptions. So the next question we move over to is, where do you actually apply? So it's a little bit different than what you may be familiar with in terms of NIH awards where you apply for grants.gov. We have an interface on Proposal Central. So this is where you can find the CASI award information here. Details about the award, the request for proposals, so you can download the information there. If you click this will take you straight to Proposal Central, and we have instructions for preparing your LOI, as well as a frequently asked questions. So this is just an example of one of the first pages of the request for proposals. A couple of things I wanted to point out in terms of special considerations. We are giving special consideration to any proposals that may be investigating the connection between climate change and human health. We would like to encourage applications in those areas, as well as proposals that may include deep or machine learning applications of artificial intelligence. We also strongly encourage applications from persons who've been historically underrepresented in the research enterprise, as indicated here on our RFP. This is the Proposal Central site, and where you would upload both your letter of intent, and then you would see whether or not you were invited to submit a full application on this site as well. And you also submit the full application on the Proposal Central site, and just begin by creating an application using the applicant or awardee box here. So the next question we move over to is the question of who. So who are the key players? So they're going to be a little bit different if you're talking about the letter of intent versus a full application. So obviously you're going to be the anchor in all of this, but don't hesitate to reach out to myself or our program associate. We're here to answer any unique eligibility or other questions you may have about your research plan and whether that actually fits into the goals of the CASI program. And then your mentor is especially important, not only for providing feedback on your essay, but also really spending time on the reference letter and speaking about your achievements, your scientific acumen, whether or not you're the person that is driving the research project that you're talking about, and speaking to your potential for having an independent research career. So really emphasizing that as well, because the only two things you have for the LOI are that 4,000 character essay as well as this letter, and both of those are equally important. So now moving over to the key players for the full application, the number is going to grow. So you can still reach out to myself as well as the program associate to answer any questions. Your mentor does not have to write another letter. So that same letter that was submitted in the LOI gets used for the full application. But now you would go and ask your graduate advisor to write a letter and also talk about your potential as a scientist and how innovative the work that you're doing is and what sort of new ground that you're breaking with the scientific approaches. This is also a place where collaborators can demonstrate their support for techniques or additional expertise. And don't forget the institutional signing official. Especially given that these are due in January. So this is going to be just coming back from the winter break. Just making sure to reach out to them early, depending on what the timeline is for signing off on your application. So the next question we move over to is how. So I get a lot of questions about what should go into the letter of intent. So what I wound up doing is looking through a variety of letter of intents that were successful and pulling out what I saw as commonalities of successful ones. So the first one, I really saw a commonality of individuals describing and really emphasizing that key biological question that remained unanswered and why this work was so important. And then in the main body of the LOI, they were providing additional background information, almost in a way as if you were teaching the reviewers why this is important, why we need to do this, and describing what needs to be accomplished in order to answer that question. Even though we don't explicitly ask for specific aims, we frequently saw that many times people frame them in a specific aims way and describing either key aims 1, 2, sometimes 3, and giving some degree of detail about the experiments that you plan to conduct in order to answer that biological question. And then frequently I would see them sort of ending on the person talking about what their future career goals were and emphasizing the interdisciplinary nature of their training background and also how that positioned them to be the best person to address the research question. And then sort of like bringing it all home and emphasizing the overarching broad impact of the research. That's one of the things that's the hallmark about the CASI Award is that we really are looking for you to think big and think about projects that could have broad impact. So in terms of structuring specific aims, if you choose to do so in this way, even though, so I would say the CASI Award doesn't have as much emphasis that the K99 does on, why you need that additional postdoc phase and your training plan and all of that. That being said, the reviewers are still sort of looking for what you're planning to do in the remaining amount of time in your postdoc. So I would suggest that your first specific aim be about that. And then your second specific aim being about what you're going to do in your faculty phase to build basis for other funding sources. And if you choose to have a third specific aim, really synthesizing the findings and demonstrating how this could be impactful in science as a whole. Other general tips. So really there's an emphasis on how innovative the research is that's being proposed, and not only that, but also what is the appropriateness of the proposed methods. Because this is an interdisciplinary award, so what is the interdisciplinary nature of the proposed research? Is the candidate trained in physics, math, chemistry, engineering, statistics, one of these types of fields, and applying these approaches to answer a biological question? Finally, how creative and original are the scientific approaches? And if a new tool is being developed, is it clear that it's being developed for a specific purpose to solve a novel biological question? And then just re-emphasizing sort of what I've mentioned before, which is that we're seeking to fund high impact approaches that may by their nature be high risk, high reward, and also seeking to fund projects that NIH typically would not fund. And this is something that I will hear the reviewers talk about. If someone has built a proposal that seems like it very squarely fits into one of the NIH institutes and centers and should be a K99 R00, it is not going to get as much consideration for a CASI award. In terms of how they're reviewed, so we have the criteria here, 1 through 5, 1 being the best, 5 being do not recommend, and it's broken up into project plan, investigator, and impact on the CASI community. And you can see some of the things that I've already mentioned in terms of tips. Um, is the research creative? Is it original? Does it have potential for large impact? Is it addressing a significant biological question? The investigator, what sort of experience do they have to move the project forward, and depth of training outside of biology? And then in terms of the impact on the CASI community, is there evidence that they cultivate a collaborative environment and collegial relationships with others? And what type of unique voice are they bringing to the CASI and BWF community? So finally, we're going to end on the what question, but this is the one where I've got the most information, because we're going to talk about what the reviewers have to say. So what I did is go through and paraphrase some of the comments, paraphrase and anonymize some of the comments that reviewers made on LOIs. So in green are ones that were a go, that moved forward to the next stage. In red, which I'll show you in a second, are ones that are no-go. And I'm going to show you examples of reviewer comments on all 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, and then phase 3, the interview. So looking at the LOI, paraphrase comments, so you can see here on the left-hand side, there were comments about how success would be remarkable and their past track record and training is excellent, and they were working on something that was very innovative. In the middle, you can see there was a comment about how much this is really at the scientific interface because of both their analytical chemistry as well as computational background. And then there were additional comments about what the project was focused on. And finally, here on the right-hand side, they indicated how it is at the scientific interface and solving a very important problem with cutting-edge methods, and the candidate was high quality. So then I tried to look at and pull out commonalities in LOIs that did not make it through. And one of the things that really stood out was that the ones that didn't make it through tended to be vague. So in this comment here, they thought it actually was well written in terms of like laying out the biological question and why it's important. But overall, in terms of what they were going to do research-wise, it was exceptionally vague. Here in the middle, they talked about the goal being compelling, but there was little information about what experiments would be done, which is essentially meaning it's vague. And at the same time, the referee writing the recommendation letter did not provide much information about the candidate. In this final example, there was another comment about how important it seems, but the proposal was vague and is claiming to solve everything about a certain area with both computation and AI. So that kind of brings us to recommendations for further recommendations for the LOI. We're on one end, you've got LOIs that are too vague, but that does not mean that you should swing in the other direction and have way too much jargon. And this is based on conversations that I've had with some of the reviewers themselves, who have said that sometimes the LOIs are written with so much jargon that they're having to really go through and try to understand what it is that they're doing. So you want to try to land somewhere in the middle, or a balance between giving enough information but not having so much jargon that a non-specialist who is not really embedded into that particular research area can't understand readily. So now we're going to move on from the LOI and talk about the full application. So these are paraphrased comments from full applications that were high ranked. What you can see in the left-hand side, there was a comment that the candidate was great and their approach to understanding this particular area was interesting. They thought the ideas and approach were creative with the potential for broad impact. So you can see that the creativity and the potential for broad impact continues to pop up in the reviewer comments of the ones that are moving on to the next phases. Here in the middle, they thought the candidate was excellent. The experiments were interesting. However, the reviewer did have potential concerns about an aspect of their experiment, even though they thought the work was exciting. And I think This is one of the benefits of having an interview stage, is that it allows reviewers, if they do have some doubts, they know, but they still think if it works, it could be exciting. They know that they could potentially invite the candidate for an interview where they can hash out and have a discussion about that, and then the reviewer can determine, the feasibility or not from their vantage point. And this other example we see here, the reviewer was pointing out both the physics and the other background of the candidate. They thought it was strong and could have a sizable impact of the field. At the same time, they thought it's possible they hadn't fully thought through how this approach was going to be applied in a particular case, but they knew that those concerns were things that they could get addressed if invited for the interview, and they were excited enough about the research that they chose to invite them. For ones that were low ranked, I thought I would give you some examples of those. So here on the left-hand side, the reviewer thought the proposal was addressing something only incrementally, and while it was still important, that it was probably too specific and not the best fit for the CASI award. In this middle example here, the reviewer thought the candidate was very strong, had great letters of recommendation, and while this was an important area, they didn't think that new ground was being broken relative to what was already being done in the field. And then finally, in this particular example, although the candidate was strong, had a strong physics background, they had more concerns about the particular modeling approach that they were taking, and they did not think it was going to be informative for their research because of the manner in which they had set it up. So now moving on from the full application, these are some of the comments that were made on candidates who interviewed that actually got funded. So during that, I try to take detailed notes so that at a minimum, I can at least follow up with those who interviewed and did not receive the award to give them some type of feedback, especially if they are planning to reapply. So for the ones that were actually funded, you can see here, so reviewers mentioned how it was a risky approach, and they were convinced it wouldn't work based on their proposal, but after they got their answers or the questions answered, they were sold on it. They thought it was high risk and something that other funders would not fund. In this example here, they mentioned it was a perfect example of someone working at the scientific interface given the person's background and approach. And if the approach works, it will have lots of applications and be very impactful. In this other example, they mentioned that the research is high risk and high reward, and based on the Q&A during the discussion, it was very clear that the person was well aware of what was happening and had thought through and anticipated problems and how to solve them. And in addition to that, they were also very strong in outreach and leadership. So for some of those who interviewed that did not get funded, most of those tended to have issues around the Q&A portion. So you can, in some cases, with the vague popping up. So here on the left-hand side, you can see their answers were very vague in terms of which direction the research was going and how different approaches could be connected. And I've seen this now in a couple of different cycles. Someone kind of, I guess, for lack of a better terminology, is dodging the question a bit, and that becomes very clear in the reviewer's mind. Here in the middle one, yeah, another example, they were hedging on answering the questions, and we're trying to force a connection to a particular field of interest that was called out in the RFP that was not really there. And it also wasn't clear why we should expect progress now as opposed to 20 years ago. So that's another thing I would mention, for some of those specific areas called out in the RFP, like climate change as an example, it will become apparent if the work that you're doing is truly connected to climate change and human health, or if there's sort of like a way to twist it around and try to force it to be connected to that. And then finally, the last example, they mentioned that they did a fairly good job of answering questions, but they were actually more broadly concerned that what they were studying may not actually be biologically relevant. So moving beyond what the reviewers have to say, some of my predecessors have conducted surveys and done some research looking at what CASI awardees have to say. And actually a preprint came out earlier this month looking at some of the differences between K-99 winners and CASI award winners, and what type of funding they go on to receive after that. They also took some quotes from the CASI awardees, and one thing that frequently comes up is that they're mentioning how the CASI award allowed them to fund risky projects for which they didn't have preliminary data. And we see this in another example. They indicated how CASI allowed their lab to take bigger risks earlier in their career, which was very critical to initiating it at a stage when they didn't have preliminary data. And they also mentioned how important the CASI network is. And that's something I also would point out relative to K99 and R00. So in my past life, as Molly mentioned, directing the postdoc office at NIEHS, I helped people apply for the K99 R00s as well, and definitely would see comments on the summary statements about preliminary data not being there. But that's not something that is, while it would be nice, it's not as critical for a CASI award, because we are willing to have people take more risks on something that has potential for greater impact. That being said, I thought I would also point out what distinguishes some of the additional features between the CASI and the K99, just to give some comparisons in terms of the eligibility, up to 4 years of postdoc, whereas CASI it's 5. I mentioned earlier we have unlimited resubmissions for CASI, whereas only 1 for the K99. We both allow international fellows to apply. The CASI award does not provide indirect costs, so all of the money that you see goes directly to you. And then one thing we also haven't talked about as much, which is flexibility. And I think this is a hallmark of foundation funding relative to government funding, which I have seen, moving from government to a foundation, is that there's a lot more flexibility in, use of the funds, in reporting requirements and all of that. Even coming down to filling out the application, there's just a lot less, I guess I would say, for lack of a better word, bureaucracy involved in the foundation process when it comes to both using and applying for the award. We don't have a summary statement for CASI, but as I indicated, especially for those who go through the interview, I do make appointments to give verbal feedback. And then in terms of phases, we have the 2-phase. So you could submit an LOI, which doesn't have as much effort needed up front, because it's a 4,000 character essay and a reference letter, and then a subset of those get invited to submit a full application. So you don't have to fill out an entire application up front only to find out whether or not you got the award. Whereas for a K99, there is only 1 phase. One thing we also haven't talked about is reviewers. So for K99 R00, they are mostly on an ad hoc basis, but for CASI, your reviewers are known. So if you go to the website that I showed earlier and just scroll down to the very bottom where that purple box is, on the left-hand side, you can go and click our previous grant awardees, as well as our advisory committee, and you can see who is currently on the committee, which will give you an idea of who may or may not be reviewing your LOI based on what your expertise is in. And in terms of funding amount, you have to see each individual IC for the guidelines, and for ours it is $560,000. Another question you might have is, what sort of support do we provide for our CASI awardees? So coming from a background of running a postdoc office, I wanted to make sure we also were supporting our postdoc CASI awardees. So last year we started up a webinar series that ran from November until this past June, having trainings, everything on negotiating your startup package to preparing promotion and tenure and hidden resources for building your career. And then we allowed awardees to then vote and select other topics of interest that we held 1 Thursday per month until this past June. In addition to that, we held facilitated networking discussions with some of our past awardees who gave tips on everything from how to set up and start your lab, to how to manage conflict in the lab, as well as specific considerations that come with being an interdisciplinary trainee, especially in cases where, let's say, you're a physicist and you join a developmental biology department. So building a network to support you if you find yourself in a situation, such as that example. And we also provided one-on-one coaching sessions with a professional career advisor. Another thing that we do is provide support in terms of helping people negotiate their faculty startup package as well as salary. This is just a snapshot of the average salaries over the past 10 years, broken down into whether they go to biology versus engineering versus physics department. We do the same thing for the CASI startup packages as well. We also have been analyzing the demographics of our awardees, so you can get a sense of who our awardees are for the past few years. This is looking at the most recent cohort, as well as looking at the breakdown of women versus men. And you can see it's kind of varied. Some years where we have a few more men, some years a few more women. So on average, it's been relatively even. Looking at the degrees that our awardees hold, so this is just to give you a sense. You can see physics and chemistry are the greatest ones, biophysics, engineering, bioengineering, math, computer science, just to give you a sense of what fields they have held. This was a snapshot taken earlier last year. We have actually since had some postdocs also transition, or additional postdocs transition to faculty. So the vast majority of individuals do transition to faculty awards. We have had some individuals who withdrew, and in those cases, it's largely because they go to an organization that we can't support as a nonprofit. So for example, if they go to NIH or HHMI, we can't support them. If they go somewhere outside of the US and Canada, such as Institut Pasteur, Imperial College London, we're not able to continue supporting them. And then if they move on to companies, we can't support them either. And interestingly, we've seen a couple of individuals that have gone on to become CEOs and startup companies that actually were utilizing research at the scientific interface of those data engineering sciences that are being used to address biological questions. We do have a handful of individuals who have gone on to use their analytical skills at Goldman Sachs, for example, as well as moving on to the USPTO, Patent and Trademark Office. So in the final couple of minutes, I've told you everything about CASI, but I also wanted to switch gears and just mention a few additional funding opportunities that may be of interest to some of you. One of those is our Diversity in Science Postdoctoral Enrichment Program, which we also call PDEP. This is for 3 years. It's a $60,000 over the course of 3 years. And this is specifically to support minoritized postdoctoral fellows who are conducting biomedical or medical research. This award also supports mentor training and collaboration between the postdoc and their mentor. And it supports the postdoc to go on to take courses, workshops, to travel to meetings in order to network. And for this particular award, you must be a US or Canadian citizen. Additional funding examples that we have, career awards for medical scientists, investigators in the pathogenesis of infectious disease. This is for earlier career faculty. Climate and human health, we have some interdisciplinary awards, and we actually are in the process of starting up a brand new award, which is going to be supporting centers of excellence in climate change and human health, and that is run by my colleague, Dr. Victoria McGovern. Innovation and Regulatory Science Awards. This is another program that I oversee. This is for faculty. And then one that is also available for postdocs is the Next Gen Pregnancy Initiative. This will not be running this cycle as strategic planning is underway to determine what focus areas in pregnancy, but you can expect that this will open up next year for the following cycle. And then finally, to close it out before I open it up for questions, just not neglecting your own self-care through the process of applying for grants, whether it's the CASI or other types of awards you might be applying for. And then also thinking about the power of yet, which is what I like to say. And I always like to tell the story of an individual when I was at NIHS, someone that applied for a couple of different grants. They actually weren't successful in those grants, but they still persisted because they really wanted to be in a tenure track position, and they wound up getting that. And then once they got that particular position, they went on to become successful in obtaining R01 funding and then ultimately getting tenure. And the process of writing the grant itself also helped them in terms of thinking through, what their projects were going to be as they were going on the faculty job market. And finally, just wanted to say good luck to all of you through this and acknowledge some of my former supervisor, Bill Schrader, that was instrumental at NIHS, Kelly Rose, who was the previous previous program officer before me at Burroughs Wellcome, and Melanie Scott, Lema Hadar, and Eliza Gary, as well as our CEO, Lou Muglia. And then this is our campus in RTP, and I will open it up now for any questions. And you can feel free to, go ahead, Molly.
Oh, I was just going to tell people, don't be shy. You can put it in the chat if you like, and I can read it for Tammy.
Well, I start then. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. That was very helpful. I have a question about the eligibility criteria. So it says for people from more technical backgrounds like physics, mathematics. I do have a PhD in neuroscience. Is there a way to still apply for it, or is this completely no, you can't?
So for that, I would suggest reaching out to me to have a one-on-one conversation, and we can talk. So I think really the main question is what type of engineering or data science or computational type experience might you have? So we do have people that their degree may not explicitly be in one of the ones we mentioned, but in practicality, what they were doing was still utilizing those approaches. So if you can make the case that you're still utilizing those approaches, even though your degree name doesn't reflect that, then you would still be eligible. And then just indicate that in the LOI after we have a conversation about your research, and also emphasize that point, when it talks about your interdisciplinary training, and have your referee talk about that as well in the letter, emphasizing your interdisciplinary training.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. You're welcome.
You mentioned a great talk. Thank you so much. You mentioned having looked at an average time that people are in their postdoc when they get this of 20 to 30 months. Is that the time that they start the application, or is this the time like about a year later when they actually receive the funding?
That was at the time of when they start the application. So in the LOI, there's like a section that asks how, as of like the date of the full application deadline, how many months of postdoc experience will you have? So it would be based on that timeline.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Tammy. I'm Jennifer. So I did my PhD at Duke in biochemistry. So I did graduate last year and staying with my PhD advisor. So my question, one of the questions is, based on my current status, I'm officially not a postdoc title, but research scholar. If I'm interested in applying for this, like the fellowship, would you account this time period as a postdoc time, or just a scholar, like research scholar time, So, and also the second question I have is, because we have we have different background and portfolio. Is it possible for me to just schedule a meeting with anyone in the advisory, like the committee, just to talk about like the details? What do I need? Or what I what do I need to do for the next 2 years just to be qualified for applying this fund?
Yeah. So,
Uh,
yeah. So your first question was about the research scholar. So essentially, so
mhm,
in our RFP, we describe what we consider as months of postdoc experience. And you can
mhm,
count either the date of your dissertation or degree conferral as when the clock starts, and then any research after that is
mhm.
considered postdoctoral research.
I
Um,
see, I see.
but we have gotten this question in the sense of some people may, have had 3 years or 4 years of postdoc, and then they move into like a research assistant professor or something like that, and not technically postdoc category. And we still
Mm,
allow that as well.
mm,
Basically, you just have to not have accepted a tenure track position and
I
can't
see.
have more than 60 months of research experience. If you, took a leave of absence or were teaching full time or something like that, that wouldn't count as part of the clock. So, hopefully that will answer your question in terms of that. And then in terms of, so I would say maybe setting up an appointment with me to discuss further details about what you could do to be competitive. And then I could see if there's any way to potentially recommend or ask an advisory committee member if they would be okay speaking to you.
That'd be great. Thank you. So basically, please correct me if I'm wrong. So basically, after the dissertation date, if I'm staying in academia doing research, that counts for like postdoc experience.
You can choose the date of your dissertation or degree conferral date.
Okay, okay. Degree conferral date. Okay. Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Welcome.
Mm.
Have another question?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm not sure if you touched on this, but what is the compatibility with if you're applying for other grants in the meantime, or is there disqualifications if like you're looking for a short-term grant, say with the NIH, or even within your BWF with like your other shorter grants? And thank you for the really informative information.
Yeah, so it's definitely fine for you to be simultaneously applying for other grants. Really, so for example, I mean, we have had people that are simultaneously applying for K99 and R00. The issue would be you couldn't simultaneously hold those. So if it came down to the decision point, you'd have to choose whether to take one of those awards versus ours. But that is for transition awards. We're fine with it if, let's say that you've got another postdoc only fellowship that is supporting you specifically in the postdoc phase, but not faculty phase. Those are fine in terms of like those are compatible with the award. And even so, one thing about our awards too, in terms of flexibility, if you already have that postdoc support and you don't need the salary support and you want to push the funds to your faculty phase, we do allow you to do that. So basically, once people get the award, we send out a survey asking what their plans are. If you plan to stay in a postdoc 1 to 2 years, or if you plan to transition to faculty, and essentially are asking them, when do you want to start getting payments? And that helps us plan out the payment schedule for people individually. I think, was that all? Did I answer your question? I think.
Yeah, that was super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And I see someone put a question in the chat, or a cardiologist doing clinical research of heart failure. Am I eligible in terms of science field, not like chemistry, computer? So, I would say that's probably something where you would set up a one-on-one meeting with me to discuss in terms, especially because we do allow engineering. And so frequently when I see people that are working on this type of work, it involves some type of engineering. So, or bioengineering. So I would say you can set up an appointment with me to discuss, and engineering and bioengineering in those fields are acceptable fields. And after this, what I'll do is share a link with Molly to send to all of you who came that has some designated slots that you could potentially sign up with for further Q&A. Any other questions?
Tammy, thank you so much. And this session is being recorded, thanks to Tammy. So we will post it on the Duke Postdoc Services orientation website. So if you'd like to go back and review it, that is where it will be. So thank you all. Please stay dry today. And thank you, especially Tammy.
Thanks. It was great to see you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.